To start off with, I wanted to show this map that we've all seen before that shows on the far right the location of Osgood's Landing, which was located at the head of the tidewater of the Powow River. It was a level piece of land that was ideal for shipbuilding. You could easily launch a completed vessel into the tidewaters at high tide. And as Ron had mentioned, then it was an easy trip to float down the Powow River to the Merrimack and then to the Atlantic Ocean, and from there anywhere in the world. It was located just a short distance downriver from Osgood Sawmill, which we know was operating by 1652, probably under a 1650 grant that we have records of. And although it's a little bit later than the scope that I'm talking about in the 17th century, but I've noted on the far left the ironworks that were established by William Morrill, we know at least by 1717. This just shows the continued development of activity along the Powow River to support all of the industrial activity, as iron was a very key portion of shipbuilding as well as raw lumber. This is a cast of characters of the skilled labor that was available in Salisbury, Amesbury in the 17th century related to shipbuilding activity. On the upper left, we have William Osgood, who is the millwright who established the sawmill. Robert Quimby, just below him, was a son-in-law of William Osgood. He is first recorded in Salisbury in 1646, and he retired from shipbuilding at Osgood's Landing in 1675 and then died in 1677. In the center, up above, we have Abraham Morrill, who was one of the early settlers of Salisbury. He was a blacksmith, and we assume that he would be forging ironwork for the early vessels that were being built at Osgood's Landing. In fact, when he died in 1662, the probate of his inventory shows that he was a part owner of a vessel, which would indicate his ownership interest from forging the ironwork. After his death, his widow married Thomas Mudgett, who was another shipwright who came to Amesbury probably late 1650s, early 1660s. We don't know his origin, probably English trained. After Robert Quimby retired, Thomas Mudgett leased Osgood's Landing as a building place in 1676. If we look at the four sons of Abraham Morrill, Isaac, his oldest, was already an apprentice blacksmith at the time of his father's death, and he continued his training and took over his role for forging ironwork for the vessels being built. The three younger sons were all trained as shipwrights by their stepfather, Thomas Mudgett. And we also know that Thomas Mudgett had an apprentice shipwright, Samuel Getchell, in 1678. And then again on this chart, I'm showing William Morrill, who was the son of Moses, was the individual who established the ironworks on the Powow above the falls before 1717. So we've looked at the location and the resources and the skill that was available. Before we get into the specific vessels, I'd like to just do a quick overview of what we know about colonial shipbuilding in the 1600s. In general, the vessels that were built at this time were quite small. The average size of all the vessels built in colonial New England are estimated to be about 30 tons, which would equate to be about a vessel about 40 feet long. A few large ships, over 175 tons, were built in the colonies, generally for English owners, and they represented only about 1% of the total production in the colonies during the 1600s. And as John had mentioned, working with this very early activity, that there's very little information about specific vessels and about builders from this period. But we are very fortunate in that we do have information that will allow me to cover some of the vessels we'll be talking about. The first one we can apply from a deposition made by Nathan Gould of Salisbury, who says when he came to Amesbury or Salisbury in 1652, he went to see Osgood's mill and noted that it was already in operations. And he was told by others that plank for Goodman Graves' vessel was sawn by the mill. He goes on to say that the vessel was gone, but he had seen it since in Boston. Now, what's interesting about this is it's one of the very earliest records of water sawn plank used for shipbuilding in Massachusetts Bay Colony. The wording is somewhat vague, but it implies that the vessel was built at Osgood's Landing and then was transported or sailed to Boston. From colonial records, we know that Thomas Graves in 1652-53 was transporting bar iron from the early ironworks at Saugus and Braintree to Salem and Boston by a boat. And that's all it says in the records. But we also know from the records that the shallop was the most common type of boat that was used in New England until about the year 1660. So we're basically from these records implying that the vessel built probably by Robert Quimby in 1652 at Osgood's Landing for Thomas Graves was most likely a shallop. And using ship models is a very good way to understand likely what these vessels look like. This is a model of the Mayflower shallop from 1620 that was most likely or similar to what was being built. It has no deck, a single mast, and would have been good to transport materials for short distances along the coast. For those of you who have been driving down Lower Main Street this past year, this is a picture of the Mayflower shallop that is at Lowell's boat shop for restoration in conjunction with the 400th anniversary of Plymouth. The second vessel we'll take a look at dates from after Thomas Mudgett leased the landing for his building yard. We have a wonderful, very rare document that is preserved in the old Norfolk County deeds, which is the actual agreement whereby Thomas Mudgett leased the landing. And under the agreement, he was required to pay Osgood 50 shillings for every vessel of 20 tons or larger that he built, and it was payable at the time of launching. We know that by 1676, Thomas Mudgett owned half an interest in Osgood sawmill. And in a court deposition from April 1679, we know that Mudgett had cut 80,000 to 90,000 feet of boards and plank on his millwright. Now, this was kind of surprising because it's a tremendous amount of material and actually far more than would be needed to build a small vessel of some 20 tons. So it made me wonder, what was he up to? And that question is answered in July of 1681 when Thomas Mudgett launched a 200-ton ship called the Daniel and Elizabeth that he built for an English merchant. And we also know from the records of the time that when the ship was fitted out, that she mounted 12 cannon. So this vessel would have been what was called a merchant frigate that was intended for the transatlantic trade. And again, turning to a model as to what this vessel would have looked like, this is an example of a model for a 17th century merchant frigate of about 200 tons in size, mounting 12 guns, full three-masted shipwright vessel with 2 decks, and quite large. The deck length is 94 feet with the overall length, including the bowsprit, would be well over 100 feet. So this was, again, a major ship built for English merchants, intended for the transatlantic trade, again, representing only about 1% of the total production in the colonies during the 1600s. So it's a very impressive piece of early shipbuilding in colonial New England. The final vessel we're going to take a look at is known as the ketch Salisbury. That was built in 1683 and launched in early 1684. She was 445 tons, which is more common to the type of activity that was going on in this period. The ketch rig became obsolete early in the 18th century, but it was the most common during the 1600s. Smaller ketch rig vessels of 20 to 30 tons were used in the offshore fishing trade, and slightly larger ketches from 40 to 50 tons were used in the West Indies trade. The Salisbury is interesting that unlike the large ship Daniel Elizabeth, this was owned locally in 8 shares, owned by the builders, by the blacksmiths who ironed her, by the captain who was the master of the vessel, and by local traders. It's interesting too that in 1684, these 8 owners petitioned the Massachusetts General Court to establish a port of record on the Merrimack River. Until that time, the closest port of record was in Salem, and it was to a great disadvantage that those who were working out of the Merrimack River had to go to Salem first before they could depart or record their imports. This is again another ship model based on plans drawn by William A. Baker, who was a noted naval historian, of a colonial ketch that he designed of 43 tons, so very close to the 45 tons of the Salisbury. It has 2 masts, 1 deck, roughly 51 feet on deck. So it's a good example of what the Salisbury would have looked like. When we look at the size of the Salisbury at 45 tons and the types of uses it was put to, we would expect that it would have been engaged in the West Indies trade. And we're very fortunate that there's a fragment of English shipping records relating to Massachusetts ports that has survived from 1686 to 1717. And in this fragment of records, we have the fact that the Salisbury of Salisbury plantation build ketch, 45 tons, was entered out on 30th of March, 1688 under Henry Wheeler Master, bound for Barbados, carrying lumber, provisions, and 4 horses. So this is a record of our locally owned vessel going out to the British West Indies. Lumber is shown as an export item, which we know was used locally, but also was very important in the exports. I was surprised about the 4 horses, and looking at the research, discovered that horses were a very important export commodity from New England to the West Indies. The horses were used in the sugar plantations to haul sugar from the field to the mills, and then actually also to operate the sugar mills themselves. On the return voyage, the ketch Salisbury would have imported products from the West Indies, primarily sugar, molasses, and rum.